I always, as my mentioned just before suggests, always take our instructions from Nigel Farage, and he said that we must focus on the fact that at 11 p.m. a year from today, it's happening, it's real, and therefore that is going to be the premise of the conversation we're going to have up here, because our focus is on Britain after Brexit. In other words, taking as read that Brexit happens. Our three expert voices here are going to talk about that. And then you heard, I thought, usefully, Professor Tim Bale ask us how many had attended antenatal classes in which the focus was all on the day of the birth and very, very little attention on the business of being parents for years and years and years after that. And there were sort of murmurs of recognition. So this session is going to try and put some, to redress that balance by, if there's some of the discussions before have been about the 29th, we're going to talk about life afterwards, about bringing up the kids once we've made that move. So let me just introduce our three speakers and then we'll plunge straight in. So on my immediate right is the Professor of Territorial Politics at the University of Edinburgh and Associate Director of the Centre on Constitutional Change, Professor Nicola McEwen. Next to me on my left is the Director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, Madeleine Sumption. And completing our panel from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, a senior research economist, Peter, I'm going to say Lavelle, am I right?
That's exactly
I've done,
right, yes.
Put the syllables in the right way, good. So the three of them, between them, are going to talk about three of the core issues, really, that came up all the way through the referendum in the form of economics, immigration, and devolution. And we're going to start with you, Nicola McEwen, on devolution. What I was just going to say about it as a starting thought was that one of the predictions from the Remain side of the argument, later branded Project Fear, was that the consequences of Brexit could be so severe that there wouldn't even be a Britain. That Scotland would immediately vote to leave the United Kingdom, and that Northern Ireland could end up either fractured or somehow its status radically changed. So that United Kingdom, as we previously understood it, wouldn't even survive Brexit. So I put that to you as a sort of opening thought, but you're going to take it your own way with a few minutes, and then we're going to pursue that after that.
Well, whether or not the United Kingdom survives Brexit, I don't think it's imminently under threat, but I don't think it's a certainty either. We've heard quite a lot about Northern Ireland today in terms of the issues around the border. The issue of a border poll about reunification is not imminent, but it's being talked about in circles more now than has been the case for many years. Similarly, in Scotland, we know, of course, there was a referendum in 2014, which didn't settle the issue in a sense, because what it revealed, similarly to the Brexit referendum, although there's some differences too, is the extent to which Scotland has become polarised on the issue of its constitutional future in the United Kingdom. And the issue, I guess, is whether Brexit exacerbates that. We know, of course, that the Brexit referendum revealed some of the considerable divergences within the United Kingdom that perhaps haven't really been discussed all that much today. And that's what I want to talk about a bit. It's interesting to note that the Prime Minister has chosen today, of all days, to do a whistle-stop tour of the United Kingdom. I think she was starting in Ayrshire, going to Newcastle, going to Belfast, going to Barry in Wales, ending up in London, talking to, I think, the Polish community. The message, the symbolic message is clear. The United Kingdom is a multinational country, a multicultural country. The subtext is that the United Kingdom government is a government for the whole of the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not clear what that means. And specifically, I'm not clear what it means when it comes to powers and how power is dispersed within the United Kingdom across its different governments and different institutional spheres. A lot of the issue around devolution and Brexit has focused not so much on the negotiations with the EU, because the devolved governments despite earlier promises, have not had a look in there so far at all. But where they have had more to say and more influence potentially is around the domestic process of Brexit, focused primarily on the EU withdrawal bill. You're probably familiar with the arguments here around what happens to the powers, the competences that have been at the EU level after Brexit. Where do those powers lie? Whatever was to happen with the EU withdrawal bill, Brexit would result in a shift in the balance of power between the Westminster Parliament and the devolved legislatures, simply as a result of the fact that, and this is assuming that we lead a single market, that most of those competences have been related to the single market. But the debate and the contentious issues around what happens to things like agriculture and the environment, other areas where they have been within the competences of the devolved legislatures, but they haven't effectively been able to make laws in those areas that would be incompatible with EU law. Now, the UK government's original approach was to centralise everything, so to at least at the outset, to repatriate all of the powers, to take back control and retain it at the Westminster level until such time as they could agree that they didn't need to do things on a UK-wide basis, and therefore they could cede some authority. From the point of view of both the SNP government in Scotland and the Labour government in Wales, who have incidentally cooperated throughout this process to an unprecedented degree, from their perspective, this has been a power raid, a raid on the powers of devolution, a power grab, if you like, in their terminology. Now, working together, they have managed to shift the UK government's position, but not to the point that they can together come to an agreement on how to amend the EU withdrawal bill. So it's entirely possible, and in fact, after reading what the Prime Minister had to say today, probable that the EU withdrawal bill will be passed without the legislative consent of the devolved legislatures. House of Lords may have something to say about that, of course, in due course. Now, what does that mean in practice? Legally, not much. There is no devolution veto over the Brexit process. The convention around legislative consent has no legal effect, but politically it may have some effect, and arguably it would be in contravention of the UK Constitution. So I think, just to end on this note, there are really some quite significant constitutional and political challenges on the road ahead, and I think there are opportunities to reshape the way that the UK is governed across its constituent parts, but it's not altogether clear to me that there is an appetite to meet some of those challenges, to share some of the power, to ensure that taking back control, if you like, doesn't mean it stays in one place.
Thank you. Just to follow up, I was very interested in what you said about the unprecedented cooperation between the SNP government in Edinburgh and the Welsh one in Cardiff. But you said it hadn't pulled off cooperation on the bill. Could you just tell us more about that cooperation and then why it hasn't achieved changes on that bill?
It has achieved something. So, I mean, the UK government has moved some distance in the amendment that it introduced, is now withdrawn, but that introduced in the House of Lords to change the way that devolution is dealt with in the bill. But they didn't move far enough for the Scottish and the Welsh governments to agree, to make that a common approach. So they have gone ahead with their own legislation now. They're still talking, they're still debating, they're still negotiating, but we don't know what will happen there.
Thank you. And then the other thing is this, who was it who said that, look, as a matter of course, it should be that any powers that are brought back from Brussels should automatically go to those devolved assemblies? That was the sort of seemed to have been the starting point. Is that Is that just gone lost by the wayside?
No, I don't think it was any powers. I think it was powers that are under the devolution legislation already considered devolved competence should lie where they fall when they come back from Brussels. And that's still, the view of both Scottish and Welsh Government.
Well, very good. So when we come back to questions and open up the discussion, we can pursue these questions of devolution more with Nicola. Let's get on to the question of immigration, which in some ways was the sort of hottest of the debates in the referendum campaign in 2016. Again, you know, the Project Fear position, if you like, was that, or rather, you know, there were two conflicting positions on immigration all the way through, but about what would happen afterwards. One side would have you believe that the issue would have been dealt with by voting for Brexit, and that would be massively changed. And then, of course, there was the Remainers who might have said, well, immigration probably will be solved because no one will want to come to Brexit Britain anyway, because it will be left destitute by this move. That would have been the Project Fear position, perhaps. But Madeleine Sumption, you know, because you're there sitting in the Migration Observatory at Oxford, so you tell us your perspective on what immigration is going to look like in Britain after Brexit.
So, as I'm sure you know, there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about what policies are going to be, and so I'm going to have to speculate a little bit. At the Migration Observatory, we like to think of ourselves as purveyors of reliable information, and so I spend a lot of time trying to avoid saying things that might be wrong, which, as a result of which, I really hate making predictions. But being on this panel, what I'm going to do instead is kind of maybe talk about some scenarios. So it's much easier. You can make predictions, and predictions are always wrong. What I prefer to do is you wait till the thing happened and then you produce your explanation. And actually it's quite difficult to disprove the explanation because usually, you know, there are lots of things going on and you can't really say exactly what it was. So let me instead tell you, when the scenarios happen, why will I say that they had happened? So scenario one is that Britain is a country of much lower immigration than in the recent past. And I think there would have been a number of possible reasons for that. So maybe policy, obviously, would be a big one. But the government introduces, in this scenario, the government introduces much more restrictive policies, something maybe somewhat similar to what we have for non-EU citizens, but for EU citizens with some small exemptions for strictly temporary workers in industries like agriculture. Maybe at the same time, as you mentioned, the UK becomes less attractive in some of the high-skilled industries, so people, we don't just choose them, they have to choose us, and maybe fewer people choose us. Another reason that one could see much lower migration is that there could actually be just some regression to the mean. I think partly by coincidence, the year running up to the referendum was record high in immigration. There were a lot of factors that all combined together to mean that that was probably unusually high, and a lot of decline in immigration that we've seen over the last year is probably due to the referendum, but I think some of it would have happened anyway, as those factors, you know, some of the things that had made the UK relatively so attractive compared to other countries, some of those factors receded. And then the other thing, and this
Can you give us an example of one or two of those factors that were receding anyway?
Yes, so we have the relative economic performance of the UK compared to the Eurozone, for example. A lot of people were coming here from Southern Europe because it took a long time for the economy to really start picking up in those countries. There's also the fact that after the accession of the Romanians and Bulgarians, there's some evidence in the immigration literature that you have kind of pent-up demand for migration when it's not been a possibility. A lot of people want to take advantage of a new opportunity, but that could, you know, mostly be a temporary thing, and then the people who really wanted to move have moved, and after that the flow slows down a little bit. So that would be the argument that some of this was just a temporary phase. The other thing, and this is a bit speculative, is it's possible that some of the data sources that we use to measure net migration, particularly to the UK, might be overestimating the share of net migration that comes from non-EU countries. And if that's the case, if there's actually a higher share of EU migration than we think, then there's potentially more scope for reduction as a result of policy. But that's a very speculative thing, and we'll see what happens there. So scenario two is the one where actually immigration didn't fall quite as much as people was expecting. And there, I think the likely explanations for that would essentially be, there were pressure for endless exemptions to the stricter immigration policies that the government wanted to introduce. You see this already. Everyone wants their slice of the visa pie. So you've got agriculture saying, well, of course, we've always had an agricultural program until we decided that we could rely on Romania and Bulgaria. Then you have, of course, the NHS, very sympathetic case, social care, everyone cares about social care. Other industries that are so reliant on migration, like food processing, construction, hospitality, all of these industries have been mentioned at some point in the debate as being a special case. But if you want to reduce migration, of course, not everyone can be a special case. So that's one factor. The other one would be, if migration doesn't fall that much, maybe we'll say, well, the fundamentals of the UK labour market didn't change. It's still a flexible labour market. It's an attractive place for people to work. Some of the high-skilled people who everyone said would be put off by the messaging of Brexit, as time passed, they maybe forgot that was something they didn't like, and so it didn't really make too much difference there. And at the same time, you have these dynamics of migration that are difficult to reduce, like family unification, so people joining the relatively large population of EU citizens and non-EU citizens already here. And then maybe some illegal immigration as well, which I think the enforcement challenge is likely to become more difficult after Brexit, because you have many of the ingredients for greater illegal immigration, in the sense that you have employers in many sectors who are very reliant on low-skilled migrants and low-skilled jobs. There's no suggestion that there's going to be any visa restrictions on EU citizens coming to the UK. People have good networks, so it'll be quite easy for them to come here and find work. So that's certainly something that can contribute. Then I'll just say a couple of things before moving on about the nature of the debate and how that might change. And there was a bit of discussion of this in the previous panel. The one with Rob Ford has some data showing the decline in the salience of migration since the referendum. One thing that we do see if you look back is that there does appear to be a correlation between how much people care about migration and the levels of migration in the country. So obviously, if you look back actually decades, you ask people what they think about migration, views tend to be relatively negative. People like to reduce it. What's really changed over time, and what you do see to some extent tracking the levels of immigration, are whether they think this is a really important issue or not. And I think if we do see much lower immigration, there could potentially be some substantive changes to the nature of our public discussion on migration, the types of things that we're arguing about. Potentially less pressure maybe for symbolic policies. I think there's been a temptation, there's not a party political point actually, on both of the major parties, there's been a temptation to announce policies that aren't really going to make a big difference, but that sound tough, and politicians feel under pressure to say they're doing something, and so they come up with policies that aren't necessarily actually going to do what it says on the tin. So maybe we could end up actually with a slightly more productive, substantive discussion of issues like integration or citizenship or what have you. That said, I don't want to go overboard. Immigration is still going to be a controversial topic. It's just inherently an area that is prone to crises of some kind. And maybe once we stop talking about Brexit and the scale of immigration to the UK, which has really taken over the debate over the last few years, we'll go back to some of those traditional topics like kind of foreign national offenders and border security and those other issues where there's a lot of scope for controversy, but there hasn't been so much time for at the moment. And then the final thing in terms of the debate, there is also some terrain for new controversies related to immigration. I think one of them, it will be interesting to see how the debate pans out about the legacy of Brexit, and particularly the registration process for EU citizens who are already in the UK. There's a real risk that just a lot of people won't apply for the programme. They won't realise they have to. Awareness might not be good in some communities. And if that's the case, there'll be big questions about what does that generate a new illegally resident population here? How does the government manage that? So that legacy issue, I think, could be politically quite important. And of course...
so almost the way the Americans have undocumented workers, that's an issue, the people who've been there for years. You could imagine that being a part of our discussion here about people from the EU who don't take part in a registration scheme, for example.
I think it could be. It depends. The big policy question is what will happen to people who miss the deadline, because we know that people miss deadlines for any number of reasons, even when it's in their immediate financial interest to do so, whether it's not facing a penalty for filing their self-assessment with HMRC or applying for child benefit, which is just going to give them money for nothing. A lot of people don't do it, and so we're not going to get 100% coverage. And the big question is going to be what will happen to the people who miss the deadline. Will there just be a generous process where they'll get quietly ushered in? Or will they actually, as the current policy in theory suggests, will they actually become illegally resident here?
Good. You didn't do a third scenario, which is that immigration massively goes up.
No, I didn't. I don't. I don't see. If that scenario happens, I will come up with brilliant explanations of why it was the case. But I don't see that happening as a result of Brexit. Immigration itself is really unpredictable, and basically every attempt to forecast it
Goes wrong.
It goes completely wrong. So that could certainly happen, but I don't see obvious factors that would lead to that related to Brexit.
I mean, very interesting your point about the pressure for exemptions and everyone wanting their slice of the visa pie, because it would have been a very interesting question to hear Nigel Farage's answer on. Who of those groups that you read out would he be able to turn to and say, no more, you're not going to get? The NHS is not going to be able to get people, fruit pickers, care sector. It was very interesting what you mentioned. How do you, beyond saying that will be an issue, which I think is fascinating, but how do you imagine that playing out? Who is going to lose out in that fight?
It's a very good question. I mean, one of the things the government is going to have to resolve is how big do they want the scale of any low and middle skilled immigration to be? Do they want to say, okay, we're just going to keep it to the very minimum, so the jobs that absolutely are unable to hire British workers, agriculture would be the obvious example of that. So almost 100% of seasonal workers in agriculture are from EU countries, according to the NFU labour survey. So you could imagine a scenario it was just a couple of those. The question is, if you open it up beyond that, where do you stop? And there actually isn't, there's no statistical way to do this. It actually comes down to politics. It comes down to what you prioritise. So do we prioritise a social care system that has access to people willing to do difficult work for not very much money? Or do we say, no, actually, we're willing to pay a little bit more, we'll have a more highly skilled, we'll skill people up in that system and do things slightly differently? These are big political questions, and I think there will be big fights.
Or does everybody get the exemption and the numbers don't go down very much?
Well, yes, if everyone gets so it's possible that everyone gets the exemption, but the government says you can come in for 2 years and then you leave. So there's a slightly different model, which is one that has been suggested actually by an interesting set of different kind of business and migration restrictionist groups, saying have a youth mobility program for the entire EU. Anyone can come. It's a little bit like free movement. Anyone can come in. They can do any job. As long as they're age 18 to 30, and then they leave after 2 years. Now that would be a very different model for doing it, and the implications of that, I think that if that happens, then the debate, I think, will be much more about what are the impacts of having people who are really here temporarily. Is that affecting integration? Does that affect impacts on communities if everyone is new and people are never settled in, versus the demand for the potential benefits for employers who at least, if they're not going to get what they wanted, which was free movement, at least they get people who, relatively free flow of labour in any occupation.
And politicians would like it because it would mean the absolute number wouldn't necessarily go up, because you could say they're just part of this scheme and they're going back. So politicians who want to keep the numbers low might like that scheme. There's a political logic that says that that's what we'll end up with, but it does obviously have longer term drawbacks as well. So I mentioned before introducing you that immigration was in some ways the central issue of the referendum campaign. The only other competitor for that title would be the economy. And again, the argument there was that it will make us broke if we leave. Remember George Osborne's threatened emergency budget. And then an argument which you hear slightly less of now from the other side was that it will make us terribly wealthy if we leave. That argument has tended to change into it won't make us poor rather than it will make us terribly rich. But I say that by just to hear from you, Peter Lavelle, because you've done the work on this. So just tell us about the economy in Britain after Brexit.
Okay, so sure, yes, I'm here representing Team Economics on the panel, so I'll talk about what we do and what we don't know about the future economic impact of Brexit. So the starting point would be to say what we know about what's already happened. There has already been an impact of Brexit. Don't get me wrong, we're all still here. And of course, it wasn't as bad as some of the predictions ahead of the referendum suggested it would be. But there has been an impact. Most visibly and immediately was the depreciation in the value of sterling by about 10% in effective terms, which has sort of fallen and not recovered since then. That then had an immediate impact, or well, I suppose a gradual impact on prices and inflation. So there's a pickup in inflation, and that pickup in inflation was, as you would expect, most profound in those goods that had a lot of imported content. And that's in turn affected living standards through wages. So wages that were had for a long time been stagnant or falling or growing weakly. In the year up to the referendum, there had been a period of reasonably healthy growth in wages. And over the last year, that growth has gone negative as a result of this increase in prices. In terms of growth, there's also likely to have been a hit to growth. It's quite difficult to measure because, of course, you don't know exactly what would have happened if the referendum result had gone differently. But relative to last year, relative to our neighbours, relative to the forecasts of growth that people had prior to the referendum, there's been a measurable decrease in growth. And it's unlikely that's the end of it. So it's a pretty big shake-up of our relations with our largest trading partner. It would be pretty unusual or pretty strange if that didn't have a further economic impact. It's not the case that countries around the world would be signing these regional trade agreements with each other if they did absolutely nothing. And that might be compensated to an extent by trade agreements with other third countries that we haven't been able to strike in the European Union. But the arithmetic of the situation means that trying to compensate for lost trade with the EU through that route is going to be quite challenging. So that said, there's obviously an enormous amount of uncertainty. And two things that make any kind of prediction difficult are firstly, uncertainty about the choices the UK government's going to make. And I like to think of that as the choice as to how much we want to tie our hands in the future. Now that might sound a bit like the antithesis of the sort of take back control idea, but so in terms of economic policy, there's two key reasons why a government might want to do that. The first is that if you tie your hands as part of an agreement, you can get another party to reciprocate and tie their hands. So if you think about any kind of trade negotiation, the basis is, so you as a domestic government, you can gain in domestic political terms if you, say, impose tariffs on imports from another country to protect domestic industry, or if you tweak regulations so that it becomes difficult for people to buy imports and they'll prefer to buy products made in some particular political constituency, or you might favour your own companies in public procurement, or you might subsidise your own companies. And what you do in a trade agreement, particularly in a deeper trade agreement, is both parties agree we're going to tie our hands, we're going to put those weapons away when it comes to trade with one another. So that's one reason you might want to do it. The second reason is there's a value in commitment. So if firms are making plans, you want to commit to a set of policies and them to be confident you're going to stick to that commitment. So one example where that might not work is, suppose the UK government reduced tariffs. The impact of that is going to be, so unilaterally say, reduce tariffs. The impact of that is going to be less effective if there isn't a long-term understanding that that's going to continue. If you might think that the next government might use its freedom to raise tariffs. You're not going to invest in relationships with foreign companies in the same way you would if you were in some sort of long-standing agreement that was difficult to renege on. And the second source of uncertainty, and this is where we get to start the economics tutorial, is in just how we measure the effects given those choices people have made. because they actually depend on things that economists know some things about, but there's a lot we also don't know about. So if you think about, the case of the EU imposing a tariff on cheddar exports into the EU, the impact of that is going to depend on how sensitive European consumers are to change in the price of cheddar. So if they're not very sensitive, the export volume of the UK to the EU is not going to change much as a result of the imposition of the tariff. And you can think about, broadly speaking, across a range of goods, it's going to matter. And that's what we'd call the trade elasticity. And of course, there are estimates of that. And in the Treasury models and the LSE models of the impact of Brexit, they've incorporated some estimates of trade elasticities. But they're pretty difficult to measure. It's not the most robustly measured quantity in economic terms. So there's going to be questions about exactly how strong the effects of trade barriers are going to be for that reason. And the second big source of uncertainty is how you measure something like a non-tariff barrier or the impact of it. So I work with tariff data now. It's great. Tariff data is the easiest data I've ever worked with. You have very detailed trade data because we can see quite easily what's going across the border, and you have that down, you can get it from publicly available websites right down to, say, the level of fermented green tea as a product. And that fermented green tea will have a particular tariff, and another slightly different product category will have its own tariff. So they're very easy things to measure, and for that reason, we often spend a lot of time talking about that. The non-tariff barriers, they're going to differ, with every bilateral relationship. Some of them are kind of existential in their impact, in that you can't export anything at all, with certain non-tariff barriers. Others aren't like that. Getting proper quantitative estimates of those things is going to be difficult. So there's two things, reasons for treating any forecast of what's going to happen with Brexit with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Thank you. I mean, you haven't committed yourself to any predictions or projections, I notice.
No.
So that's fine. We understand that. We understand the nervousness around that. But just in sort of more logical terms, and it was in a way in Anand's question to Nigel Farage about, do you accept that trading with your partners, with countries that are near, is more economically efficient than trading with countries that are far away? And if you accept that, it does seem just on its face as if coming out of, and we've all, I think, been accepting the basis of our conversation that Brexit means leaving the customs union and the single market. Surely just on its face, economically, it is disadvantageous. And I don't think Nigel Farage particularly tried to argue against that. He said, you can't buy my freedom. He didn't try and say, no, we're going to make a lot of money. So just from wearing your sort of economist hat, is it just on its face clear, without making a prediction, that economically we have to almost just logically be worse off by making this move?
Well, so the reason I say the arithmetic of the trade situation is difficult, so, roughly speaking, half our trade is with the EU, and you think half our trade is with the rest of the world. To keep that trade constant, every percentage point you lose with the European Union, you have to gain about a percentage point with the rest of the world. Again, roughly speaking, the numbers are sort of, But, and the difficulty in doing that is, of course, the EU is an example of a really deep trade agreement. So tariffs between EU members in the common market were abolished in 1968. Everything the EU's been doing since then in matters of trade has been to try and get rid of these non-tariff barriers and other aspects of protection. So, and they're just going to be difficult to get any country to agree on those kind of things. And also, within the EU, you have that wrapped up with things like freedom of movement and things which are complementary to trade. And the other thing that makes it difficult is, of course, you're working from a position where the EU does already have some existing agreements with that rest of the world bloc, including important trading partners for the UK like Switzerland. There's a very deep trading agreement between the EU and Switzerland and Norway. It's just signed an agreement with Canada, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to kind of, and of course, integration with the EU appears to be continuing. So you have to you have to sort of play catch up in that respect. In terms of the distance relationship, my favourite example is trade in radioactive isotopes, because they
My favourite too.
because they decay. You can't import a radioactive isotope from a long way away. It has to come
Right.
from a nearby source. And in something like manufacturing, generic components you might want to source from around the world, but things you need really customized or in just-in-time for production methods, you're naturally going to want those things to be geographically closer to you.
It's just, I suppose, what's behind it is I've seen those figures, and you tell me if they're wrong, that just say even if everything goes swimmingly, we do great deals with America and India and other places, they just are going to be a drop in the ocean in terms of making up what we lose. The projections, I think even the most optimistic, they're in the small, low single figures percentage-wise, rather than we're just losing this big advantageous thing with this massive block on our doorstep. But maybe I'm just too much of a Guardian reader, but just tell me if that
well,
is
I
how
can
you
tell
see
you
it.
the underlying logic behind those predictions is about, firstly, the importance of the non-tariff barriers and how difficult they are to remove with respect relative to tariff barriers. And the second thing is just the fact that the EU is a very big, important trading partner, but and China is a much less important trading partner for the time being. Obviously, in the longer term, these things will change. But
Thank you, all three of you. We've heard plenty of questions from me. I think we should take questions from all of you, and in these three areas, and something else that we haven't yet thought of, perhaps, because three keen minds on devolution, the economy and immigration, but there may be other things about Britain after Brexit as well. So lots of hands up. Why don't we start with the lady here?
Thank you. And I think my first question is to Peter. Thank you for explaining non-tariff barriers. So in a sense, it is difficult to estimate NTBs, and I think that's something that has come up in all the reports. But that makes me think, could you explain China's export-led growth and the rising trade with EU, and could that possibly be a looking glass to understanding post-Brexit UK's trade with EU?
Why don't you just come back on that right away, Peter?
So Chinese export. So I guess what you mean is so that China managed to export a lot.
Perhaps like to understand how has the Chinese deal with EU? I mean, how have they struck out the NTBs? I mean, do they have quite an elaborate way of understanding NTBs with EU? And if that is the case, why couldn't a possible situation of completely arbitrary NTBs being more moderate towards UK, if that makes sense?
Yes, it's a good question. So in terms of like the practicalities of how does a Chinese firm make sure that products meet European standards? So I just don't know about the practicalities of what Chinese firms do in that respect. But it's also, so where estimates of NTBs or non-tariff barriers do exist, they're particularly high for things like food, where there'll be phytosanitary standards that you have to meet, or things like financial services, and those weren't the kind of things that China was exporting. Yes, I don't think I'd like to give a better answer. But
No, that's good. I just want to ask you about this question, Nicola, about the single market thing, because that was one of the things that was said by the Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP straight after the referendum. There is no way you're taking Scotland out of the single market, they said. It's just too important for us. And you hear less of that now. And so if it does come to it, as the indications from some of our speakers today were that it will come to it, does Scotland just leave and just take it, exiting from the single market? And what will it do for Scotland, for example?
I think the Scottish Government issued a position paper a year and a bit ago now, where they said their first preference was for the whole of the UK to remain within the single market, and failing that, to have some sort of special arrangement that would allow Scotland and probably Northern Ireland to remain within the single market in some capacity, even if the rest of the UK did not. Now that, in my view, was never a particularly practical solution, but it does pose difficulties. There is an awful lot of consensus within Scotland that the single market is a good thing. Now, in a sense, so if the independence issue were to come up again, you can see that all of these debates that we're having now could potentially provide a sense of grievance, a reason, a catalyst to have the debate again in a way that wasn't there before. Remember, we had this vote the last time for no reason. There was no grievance. People were quite happy with devolution. They were quite happy with the UK as it was, but there was a political opportunity to have the debate, to have the vote. Now there is potentially a reason and a grievance, but the UK outside of the single market and an independent Scotland potentially within the single market, either within the EU or within the EEA, causes all sorts of practical and economic difficulties. Some of the issues that are being debated now around the island of Ireland would be transposed to the Anglo-Scottish border. Some of them wouldn't, of course, there's the history too, but some of them would. So I think what matters, what happens and what is negotiated for both the North-South relationship on the island of Ireland and the East-West relationship between the Republic and the UK will feed into debates about the Anglo-Scottish relationship under different constitutional scenarios.
Fascinating. I would love to ask you more about that, but I should let other people get in. You had your hand up early on, and then maybe what we'll do is we'll take a group of questions, because otherwise we're not going to get everyone in. So if you could get the microphone to that chap there, and then there's a hand there, and we'll hear 3 questions. Yeah.
Okay. All this talk about antenatal and bringing up the kids, I actually have a question. It was about sex, or perhaps in the spirit of one of the earlier panels, Brex, I don't know. So there was a young lady in the front there who asked the economics panel about whether she would have to jump into bed with her car salesman if she wanted to buy a car. In other words, whether you needed to be in a customs union to continue. So, I mean, one of the areas where cross-fertilisation is very much an issue, of course, is Ireland. We had the other TB here this morning, and so my question is about the Good Friday Agreement. Can it, in its present form, actually survive, given that there are those in and around government who are brazenly talking about introducing changes which could scupper it altogether?
Great.
Can the
Can the Good Friday Agreement survive Brexit? Thank you. And who's got the microphone next here? Somebody should already have it. You have, and then let's get it to the lady with her hand up. Yeah.
Could I just ask a quick question about fish? The controversy leading up to the transition period, fish
Yeah.
Yeah.
is still going to be within, in particular relation to Scotland, because this seems to be an area where Scottish fishermen might be out of line with the SNP government.
So what's the question?
What long-term arrangement do you think we'll have with fish? Because we want to get control, according to the Brexiteers, of our fish in our British waters, but actually we sell most of our fish to the EU.
I see. Thank you. And then here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophia Wilpers, representing London First, not related to Britain First. Farage just pointed out that the low productivity of the UK is somehow linked to Eastern European immigration. The MAC interim report just highlighted that business actually thinks that the best workers that they hire are sometimes the EU workers, and they have pointed out that the EU workers are often more motivated and have higher skill levels than their UK counterparts. So business is super dependent, obviously, on access to EU talent. So my question would be, is there any other possible option for the UK to keeping access to EU labour that is politically sellable to the general public, besides something like a youth mobility program, which would obviously not quite cover the gaps that losing access to EU talent would leave?
Thank you. I think you should pick that one up. Is there any option that's available to a post-Brexit Britain that would allow Britain to keep access to that pool of European labour that is politically palatable?
So there was a lot of conversation about potential modifications of free movement. You know, can we kind of tweak it a little bit around the margins in order to be able to stay in the single market? My view on this basically is that free movement is really quite an all or nothing thing. And any changes, when you look at the types of things the EU has been willing to entertain, like a very modest temporary restriction on access to in-work benefits for migrants, this is not a group that is, vast majority of EU migrants are not using in-work benefits. These kinds of changes that are being discussed are really symbolic rather than things that would actually massively reduce the numbers of people who are willing to come here. So I'm not an expert in the politics of this, but I find it difficult to imagine that could be sold, that a modification of free movement could be sold as something that was really different and not free movement.
Well, what about that thing that said there was the mechanism available there, this emergency handbrake? Well, there's two things that were said. One, there were mechanisms available and David Cameron just didn't use them. Somebody's jumping up and down. Just wait, I'll come to you later on. There were mechanisms and they were available, he just didn't use them. And then the other one, which is the handbrake, which is used in the EEA, Liechtenstein, etc. And the argument has been, well, fine for those very small economies, small countries, but not really plausible for us. Can you just say something about those two?
Yes, there are options available. The question is, do they actually really restrict migration? And one of the problems with free movement, so the fundamental principle of free movement is not having selection, so not being able to say, we want this guy who's skilled and we don't want that one who's not. So if you have an emergency brake, you either have an emergency brake that isn't used or that is so where there's a cap that's so high that it doesn't matter, in which case, why have it at all? Or you have one that actually causes a lot of problems. So let's say that you had an emergency brake that really brought down the numbers. What on earth do you do when you're not allowed to prioritize applications? You're either going to have a big backlog of people waiting for slots to become available. Employers then, they try to recruit a candidate. They're told that there's, a 2-year backlog or whatever, or you have some kind of lottery. You get all sorts of problems trying to implement these caps. So I think that there really is a trade-off between essentially having something that's symbolic and isn't going to make any difference, and having something that maybe would make a difference, but that could be quite damaging in other ways.
So the bottom line is, if you don't want to be in the single market, if you want free movement, you have to be in the single market. If you want immigration, you have to have free movement, etc.
Yeah, if you want to bring down the numbers, you want to select as well, and that means not being in the single market, not having free movement.
Let's hear you on the Good Friday Agreement and whether it can survive Brexit.
I hope so, because the alternatives are deeply concerning. And I think the thing with the Good Friday Agreement is, or one of the things with it, is that it was extremely hard fought for, and it is seen as a comprehensive, in its entirety, package. So already we're seeing strains with the collapse of government in Northern Ireland, the difficulties in resurrecting devolution, and the lack of voice that gives for a consensus in Northern Ireland, a consensus view in Northern Ireland anyway, in all of these discussions. But if you start to unpick it, as some have suggested, then I think that is well, irresponsible, frankly, and deeply, deeply worrying.
But how could it be solved in terms of leaving the government wants to leave the single market, leave the customs union, but also have no hard border? And does that seem like a logical puzzle?
Well, that's a different issue in a sense, and I don't think that can be solved, actually. So I don't. So in that sense, so I think there will have to be, and I think the UK government knows that. And the issues, it seems to me, in terms of the island of Ireland, are not technical issues. They don't have technical solutions. They're deeply political, and so clearly. We didn't talk very much in the political panel about the DUP, but clearly the position of the DUP and its relationship with the Conservative government is very much part of the problem that makes that difficult to reconcile.
Good. Can you go on to fish? Move on to fish.
You're quite right that, well, two things. One, there isn't unanimity within the fishing community. There are quite diverse views across the different fishing organisations that doesn't always come across. But second, yes, the prevailing view, if you like, is out of step with the SNP's position of remaining within the EU and the Common Fisheries Policy too. But in the short term, at least, the controversies over the transition arrangements and the issues around fish have created considerable difficulties for the Scottish Conservative Party, who, with much fanfare after the election of their 13 MPs, talked up their importance and influence within the House of Commons and have been left exposed by the decision to postpone or to maintain the UK within the Common Fisheries Policy, and for that issue to very much be on the table for the future as well.
Okay, let's take another round. I think you must go because you've been desperate to speak. Let's bring the mic. Well, hold on, wait till the microphone reaches you. But make it short if you can, because I'm seeing notes, which worries me that a speech is coming. So let's just have a nice short question, and then we'll take more over there. We'll take the lady there. Yeah, you go first.
Returning to the sore point of immigration. It's very quick. Yeah. In the Second World War, we were 2 weeks short of starvation with only 40 million people. Now the United Kingdom is the most densely populated country in Europe. Now, somehow or other, we have got to get the numbers down. Then it can be done in a nice way. I can understand a youngster not wanting to work in a hotel if everybody else is a Pole. But somehow or other, have a look at the sewers, then come back and say how many you'd like.
Right, okay. Let's go to the lady here, yeah.
You talked about the fact that, of course, casual workers wouldn't get the visas to stay. You also talked about the 18 to 30-year-olds coming over perhaps for having a 2-year visa. Have you thought about the Australian way of doing it, which is that in order to have your 2 years of staying in Australia, you have to do 90 days as a casual worker in the agricultural sector? Wouldn't that be a useful thing to think of here?
Okay, and who was the third hand that we have up? You've been waiting patiently, why don't we go for you here? Yeah.
Thank you. John Newman with a question on devolution, because whilst Hollywood and Cardiff Bay have enjoyed some increasing powers in the last few years, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Carwyn Jones who once described the proposals in the EU withdrawal bill as a power grab. So my question, quite straightforward, is what is the future relationship between Westminster, Hollywood and Cardiff Bay likely to look like?
Okay. Let's start with you on this proposal that, like Australia, if we've got a gap that we need to plug in terms of casual workers, again, in terms of agriculture, the Australian scheme apparently is that each person who wants to stay has to first do 90 days as a casual worker. And the questioner asks if that's something we should look at here.
Yeah, there are various proposals floating around, not just about agriculture, but other industries where, maybe you could have a youth mobility scheme, but then push people into some kind of shortage occupations or whatever occupations we want to fill. In Australia, that program has worked in the sense that how it works is you can get 1 year visa and do anything, but if you want to stay for the second year, then you have to do your 3 months in agriculture. And it has been successful in the sense that it has indeed pushed a lot of people into agriculture and a lot of people from wealthy countries where the government is less worried about overstaying and those kind of risks. There's actually been a lot of criticism of that policy as well, which partly is that because people have to do their time in agriculture, there's a lot of exploitation in that industry, and a lot of the people. Actually, you would expect that people from relatively high-income countries are not very prone to being exploited, but actually, there's a fair amount of evidence that they are, and that some people, they don't even realise that they're entitled to be paid for their work in agriculture, and so there are a lot of issues around. In that you would want to deal with, but certainly, that's one of the options on the table.
The other thing that struck me as being a potential problem with it is, okay, it solves one problem, agriculture, but you listed a whole lot, the NHS, care, food processing, that are all going to need workers. So, I mean, we're back to the same problem there. Everybody's going to need this, and you can't just single one sector. Yes, and the more sectors you have in there, the more people will gravitate to the less onerous or more attractive industries. So which is one of the reasons actually why some employers in agriculture are very supportive of the idea of a return of the seasonal workers scheme, where the employer basically has a kind of visa tie on the person, that it's quite difficult for the person to move to a new job even if they want to, and that in itself obviously, for obvious reasons, is controversial too. And you're resisting saying this is the kind of mess you get into once you start blocking immigrants coming from the European Union, but you're resisting the temptation to say that. I mean, there are trade-offs with everything, right? I mean, there's clearly a strong desire to reduce migration. It's also the case that if you want to reduce migration, then from an economics perspective, low-skill migration is where you want to do it. Yeah. Obviously, that will have lots of consequences. Power grab and what the future relationship might look like.
It depends. So when devolution was introduced, there was very little thought given to how the different bits would work together. So for a long time now, there's been a sense that the system of intergovernmental relations is not fit for purpose. Now, what we've seen since the Brexit referendum is an unprecedented intensification of that relationship. So the governments meet a lot more now than they ever did before, but it has also exposed the weaknesses in the system. And I think there is recognition, at least in parts of the UK government, that they need to do something about this. But there is nervousness too, that if you design a system where the UK government essentially shares some power with the devolved governments, then A, it might not always get its own way. B, what happens when you have disputes between administrations? C, who speaks for England? We don't have a federation. But there also, I think, would have to be a cultural shift. And that, I think, might be one of the biggest barriers. Some of the other ones you can fix, you can come up with schemes and mechanisms, but there has to be a willingness to cede, to take control, yes, but to cede some control internally within the United Kingdom.
You asking that question, who speaks for England, prompts me to ask about the Anthony Barnett thesis in this book, The Lure of Greatness, this book of his in which he says Englishness and lack of outlet for English identity, in his view, is one of the things that drove Brexit. And he notices that England, that without London, basically was what drove Brexit. Everyone else voted to remain. And I wonder if you think that's important here. The who speaks for England question is perhaps the central question underneath all of these other ones.
I think it is important, and clearly the most obvious attempt to try to resolve it to date has been evil. Not sure it really gets there.
You mean English votes for English laws
votes
rather
for
than...
English laws, yes.
Yes.
Sorry, yes.
Not everyone immediately got that.
It wasn't an adjective, yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
You weren't suddenly lapsing into hyperbole.
No. Sorry. Where was it? But the point I wanted to make was that what we have also seen over the last few years is a kind of mutually reinforcing thing where those who felt most English, as opposed to British, those who were most attached to an English identity were, yes, also among those who were most Eurosceptic and most pro-leave, but also those who had most problems with devolution. So that kind of sense of dissatisfaction with the way that England is governed has that external dimension with the EU, but an internal dimension too.
Fascinating. Okay, this will have to be the last bit. So we'll take, I can see two there, and lady here, and that will probably be our last thing. The chap there, and then here, and then there. I'm sorry about that, because I think we're going to be out of time.
Thank you very much.
It's a short one. Yeah.
My name is Mike Glover from Renew. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Jonathan on behalf of The Guardian for some great reporting recently, and also for some journalistic balance in wearing a UKIP-coloured tie, which I think was really very helpful. But my biggest concern is about the future. I don't really touched upon the future as it could go wrong, potentially. If the economic forecasts are correct, and there is a big drop in economic activity, which causes a big drop in tax collection, how do we fund our already overstretched services, like National Health Service, with the biggest contribution being obviously to pensions, 160 odd billion per year, of 12.5 million pensioners. So who's going to pay for all this, and how are we going to fund it?
Thank you. Is there somebody over here? Yeah. Oh, you want to go there first? Okay. Well, while you're talking, we'll pass the microphone. Yeah, you.
Jonathan, thank you. Mark Johnston again. Question to Madeleine. Back to the start of the day, Tony Blair proposals. So imagine withdrawal fails and we stay in. He said the UK could do something along the lines of Belgium, where there's people without economic means or without an income are sent home. To what extent do you think that is practical and realistic? And if it were, or if it is, to what extent might it have an impact on the numbers? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you're there. If we take the microphone from this gentleman, hand it over to the man there who was I excluded before. There we are. I'm just feeling not lenient. There we go.
I wanted to ask about the sort of your thoughts on the future UK-USA relationship. I know that Theresa May was the first foreign leader to meet Trump, and Trump has said that I'm not sure if the UK will be front of the queue for a trade deal, but that he's eager to do a trade deal with the UK. And just your thoughts generally on this sort of the importance of America in the sort of post-Brexit world.
Thank you. And the last one over here.
Well, following on from that, is there an opportunity post-Brexit to bring home the Brexit revolution, and go for a low corporate tax, low personal tax, looser regulated economy, and allow unproductive companies to go bust? So it really put pressure on the EU to give us a good deal by going that, becoming the Singapore of Europe.
Okay, thank you. We've got lots of questions there. Lots of them are in the economic area. Why don't you just take that first one, Peter, on if the worst predictions are right and the revenue drops like a stone, how are we going to fund the health service and pensions? Do you foresee that kind of scenario? Start with that one.
Yes, so the public finances of Brexit is what we've written about in the booklet you guys have all got. The key issue, on the plus side, of course, if you're not making contributions to the EU, there's a saving there. In net term, that's about £7-8 billion. But that's in GDP terms, that's roughly 0.5% of GDP. So what's really going to matter over the longer term, very quickly, is what the economic impact is. Because a very small change in growth will quickly offset that saving. And the OBR's numbers so far imply a kind of, about a £15 billion worsening of the public finances. They attribute that to three things. One is higher inflation as a result of the sterling depreciation, and that feeds through into bond yields and the price you pay on your debt. The second one was lower immigration. And the third one was lower investment. But it definitely, the whole thing is likely to make the fiscal environment more challenging, put it that way.
Getting a bit radical with this, getting a bit hardcore. But if that happens, how do we pay for the health service and for pensions?
Well, the old-fashioned way, right? So that you have to increase taxes, or you borrow to smooth out the shock with borrowing. Or you find savings elsewhere. I'd like to be able to give more, but
it could be more boring. And then, Madeline, the question, I'm going to come back to you on economics because there was one more, but let's, Madeline, just pick up this question. The Belgian proposal, apparently floated, I wasn't here, but by Tony Blair, about people of insufficient economic means could be asked to go back home.
So this is one of a number of the options that basically involve kind of keeping free movement but pretending that we're really changing it. I think the reason that we have significant amount of European migration to this country is not because there are people with insufficient means. Actually, EU citizens have found it really easy to get jobs here. That we have very high employment rates. Many of them are doing quite well. So I think you'd be kidding yourself if you thought that, unless it's just purely about politics, you've got to say that you're doing something to reduce the numbers, and so everyone comes up with a different fiction. It's just really difficult to imagine that these policies could have anything more than a really marginal impact.
Thank you. This doesn't fall in any of your three areas particularly, but the importance of America to Brexit, Britain. Do you want to have a go at that? There's obviously a trade element, which we'll put to Peter, but do you want to go on the sort of politics of that?
Not really, except I'll combine it with the broader question about the economic outcomes. Because accepting what Peter said about the difficulties in making forecasts, those forecasts that we have seen, including those from the UK government, suggest that any negative economic effects will not be felt uniformly. In other words, there will be significant regional effects that can put strain on territorial relationships within the United Kingdom. Now that's within England also, as well as between the four territories. Now, the Scottish Government in particular feels, I think, particularly vulnerable on this in light of the increased powers it had over taxation. Now, they are responsible for raising the income tax from all income tax from all those resident within Scotland. So they are exposed for their spending needs around health, education, and so on. If there is a downturn in the economy, that reduces the tax base for them, which is one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why we see a very pro-immigration stance and pro-single market stance from the Scottish Government.
Why don't you, Peter, close us out with just, first of all, the importance, particularly the trade relationship. The way I would just calibrate the question is, a lot of people were betting everything on a great trade relationship with America, front of the queue and all that, and then we've seen Donald Trump putting tariffs on and returning to a protectionist economic model. So does that shake the confidence people might have in a post-Brexit Britain, having good trading relations with America? And then what did you think of the questioner's idea that we be the Singapore with low corporation tax, low regulation, etc.?
So in terms of the opportunities with the United States, so part of this has sort of been covered before, so that the United States is a big, important economy. It's not as important a trading partner as the EU is for the UK. One particular issue, so the Trump administration's produced something akin to a philosophy on what they see the future of world trade looking like. And it's a pretty different settlement from the WTO settlement where countries, you reduce your tariffs and I reduce my tariffs. There's more of an emphasis on a bilateral, if you don't cut your tariffs on our goods, we're going to raise tariffs on your goods. So there's a kind of different model of trade that they're thinking about. And where Britain fits into that, whether if we caught in the crossfire between warring states in a big trade war, or whether we'd escape, I mean, it's difficult to say. In terms of, Singapore. This is a very difficult one. The EU didn't control UK corporation taxes, so the UK has been cutting corporation tax, over the last couple of years, of its own volition. In terms of this is something that we've, according to the press coverage at least, the EU does regard as a kind of concern that the UK might become this kind of low tax, low regulation economy that's going to cause problems for them in some respects. So, I mean, there's, You
could say that you think it's a bad idea, if you like.
I'm not. So we don't talk about the size of the state or things like that. I mean, I don't want to get in, should we be a low tax economy or a high tax economy?
It's a different question.
It's a different question. Stimulate the economy.
Different ways to do that.
There are different ways. Yeah, I mean,
Good.
I'm not going to be drawn on what
No,
I
I've picked that up. Excellent. So what I take away from this is that the members of the Academy are much better at keeping impartial and fair and neutral on this than journalists. So I'm impressed by them. I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking Pete Everett and Nicola McEwen and Madeleine Sumption. I'll hand over